Elias Thorne loved the quiet dust of the Grand Antiquities Museum. He loved it more than anything, honestly. Every morning he arrived at exactly 7 o'clock, not a minute sooner, not a minute later. His keys would jingle, a lonely sound in the vast silent lobby. He would walk the same path every single day. First, he checked the locks on the main doors. Then, he would patrol the Egyptian wing, making sure the sarcophagi were undisturbed. After that, he'd visit the Roman gallery, his footsteps echoing on the cold marble floors. He liked routine. It made him feel safe. The museum was his kingdom, and he was its careful, watchful king. He had a special name for each hall. The Hall of Kings was where the Egyptian pharaohs rested. The Whispering Corridor housed the Greek statues, their marble lips seeming to hold ancient secrets. Elias felt he knew each artifact personally. He would gently dust the glass case of a Roman helmet, imagining the soldier who once wore it in a forgotten battle. He would polish the display sign for a Viking longboat, feeling the chill of the northern seas. To him, these were not just objects. They were sleeping stories, and his job was to make sure their slumber was peaceful and undisturbed. The silence was his favorite part, a heavy blanket that covered everything in history. But the museum wasn't just his job, it was his entire world. He didn't have many friends. He didn't have family nearby. The stone faces of forgotten emperors were his companions. The faded tapestries depicting heroic hunts were his evening stories. He would often stay late, long after the last visitor had gone home, just to be alone with the quiet. He would sit on a bench in the medieval hall and just listen. To what? He wasn't sure. The groans of the old building, maybe. Or perhaps something else, something deeper, a secret the museum only shared with him, its most loyal guardian. His routine was a shield. It kept the world out and the museum's secrets in. At the end of each day, he locked every door in a precise order. He would check his watch, ensuring it was exactly 9 o'clock when he turned the final key in the grand entrance. The heavy oak doors would groan shut, sealing him away from the noisy, modern city outside. He would stand for a moment on the steps, breathing in the cool night air, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The museum was safe. The stories were sleeping. And he, Elias Thorne, was their protector. Tomorrow he would do it all over again. One Tuesday, the routine broke. It started small, almost too small to notice, but Elias noticed everything. A Roman coin, usually centered perfectly on its velvet cushion, was now sitting a few inches to the left. He frowned, his brow wrinkling with concern. He was the only one with keys. Who could have moved it? He carefully unlocked the case, his fingers trembling slightly as he nudged the coin back into its proper place. He told himself it was just a vibration from a passing truck, a simple explanation, but a cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach. The museum felt different today. It felt wrong. The next day, it was a spear in the Hall of Warriors. The weapon, usually angled at 45 degrees, was now pointing straight at the ceiling. Elias stared at it, his heart thumping like a drum. This was no accident. Someone or something was playing a game with him. A cold draft snaked around his ankles, even though all the windows were sealed shut. It was a strange cold, a damp and musty chill that seemed to cling to the air and seep into his bones. He shivered, pulling his worn cardigan tighter around himself. The familiar silence of the museum now felt heavy, watchful. He felt like he was being observed by unseen eyes. Then came the smells. A faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves began to drift from the Mesopotamian exhibit. Elias sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling in disgust. It smelled like a freshly dug grave. He searched for the source, checking for leaks or open vents, but found nothing. The smell was just there, hanging in the air like a ghostly shroud, getting stronger with each passing day. The museum, once his sanctuary, was starting to feel like a tomb. He started leaving the lights on in hallways he passed, no longer comfortable with the deep shadows that he once found so comforting. The strangest event happened on Friday. He was walking past the Colonial America exhibit when he heard it. A faint, scratching sound. It came from inside a display case holding a porcelain doll. The doll's head, which always faced forward with a painted-on smile, was now turned. It was looking right at him. Its glassy blue eyes seemed to follow him as he backed away slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The scratching stopped. The silence rushed back in, louder and more terrifying than before. Elias knew then, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that he was no longer alone in his museum. Fear was a new feeling for Elias within these walls. It was a cold, unwelcome guest that followed him down every corridor and lurked in every shadow. He couldn't sleep. He would lie awake at night, picturing the doll's head turning, hearing the phantom scratching sound. The museum had become a place of anxiety, its quiet halls now filled with a menacing potential. He started talking to himself, whispering reassurances as he did his rounds. It's just the old building settling, he would murmur, but he didn't believe it. He knew something sinister had taken root in his sanctuary, and he had to find out what it was before it was too late. He decided to search for answers in the one place he rarely visited, the museum archives. The archives were a labyrinth of dusty shelves and forgotten records located deep in the building's basement. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decay. He pulled a chain, and a single bare bulb flickered to life, casting long, dancing shadows. He felt a shiver run down his spine. This was the heart of the museum's secrets, a place where history was not just displayed but buried. He needed to find a connection between the strange events, a clue that would explain the cold spots, the moved objects, and the terrifying smells. He started with the acquisition logs, looking for anything unusual that had recently arrived. His fingers, covered in a fine layer of grey dust, traced the lines of spidery handwriting in the old ledgers. For hours he searched. Then he found it, a recent entry logged just a few weeks ago for an item listed simply as the obsidian mirror. It had been donated by an anonymous collector. There was no photograph, only a short cryptic note attached to the page. It said, "Beware its gaze. It does not reflect what is, but what can be. It hungers." A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. An obsidian mirror? He didn't remember seeing any such object on display. Driven by a mix of terror and determination, he dug deeper. He found a cross-reference to an older, leather-bound book tucked away on a high shelf. The book was filled with warnings about dark artifacts. He found a chapter on the mirror. The ancient text described it not as a museum piece, but as a key that could open a doorway to a place of shadow and eternal cold. It spoke of a ritual that required the mirror and a gathering of believers who wished to call forth something ancient and terrible. The book warned that the ritual would drain the life from its surroundings, making the air cold and the world silent. Elias's blood ran cold. The ritual was happening here, in his museum. The knowledge changed everything. The museum was no longer just haunted, it was ground zero for something unspeakable. Elias felt a crushing weight of responsibility. He was the only one who knew. The police would think he was crazy. Who could he tell? His fear was a constant companion now, a cold hand gripping his heart. He walked the halls with a new sense of dread, seeing every shadow as a potential threat. He imagined dark figures slipping through the galleries at night, their whispers echoing where only his footsteps should be. He knew he couldn't just leave. He had to protect the museum. He had to stop them. He decided to set a trap. That night, he didn't go home at 9 o'clock. Instead, he broke his own sacred routine. He pretended to lock the main doors, making the familiar loud sound of the bolt sliding into place. Then he slipped back inside, his heart pounding against his ribs, and hid in the dark balcony overlooking the grand atrium. It was the largest open space in the museum, the perfect place for a gathering. He crouched behind a marble pillar, his body trembling, and waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence of the museum pressed in on him, heavier and more menacing than ever before. Just after midnight he heard it. Not the whisper of ghosts, but the soft scuff of shoes on the marble floor. A side door, one rarely used, creaked open. One by one, figures cloaked in dark, hooded robes slipped into the atrium. There were 5 of them. They moved with a silent, unnerving purpose, their faces hidden in the deep shadows of their hoods. They didn't speak. They glided across the floor like spectres, their silence more terrifying than any shout. Elias held his breath, pressing himself flatter against the cold stone of the pillar. He was watching a nightmare unfold in his beloved museum. They gathered in the center of the atrium. One of them carried a heavy object wrapped in black cloth. Carefully, they placed it on the floor and unwrapped it. It was the obsidian mirror. It was larger than he had imagined, a perfect circle of polished black stone that seemed to drink the dim light from the room. It didn't reflect anything. It was like looking into a bottomless pit. The figures formed a circle around it and began to chant. The words were in a language he didn't understand, harsh and guttural. The air grew impossibly cold, and a low hum vibrated through the floor, a sound that felt ancient and wrong. Elias watched from the shadows, his body frozen with a terror so profound it felt like ice in his veins. The chanting grew louder, more frantic. The air in the atrium crackled with a strange energy, and the obsidian mirror began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. A thin black mist started to seep from its surface, coiling on the marble floor like a nest of shadowy snakes. The figures raised their arms, their voices reaching a fever pitch. Elias knew he had to act now. If he waited any longer, whatever was on the other side of that mirror would come through. The museum, his world, would be lost forever. With a surge of adrenaline that banished his fear, he stood up. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find nearby, a solid bronze bust of a Roman senator. It was heavy, but his desperation gave him strength. "Stop!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the vast cold space. The chanting faltered. 5 hooded heads snapped up to look at him on the balcony. For a terrifying moment he saw their faces, pale, with eyes that burned with a fanatic light. He didn't hesitate. With a mighty heave, he hurled the bronze bust over the railing. It sailed through the air, a missile of history aimed at a dark future. The bust struck the obsidian mirror with a deafening crash. The sound was like a thunderclap mixed with a scream. The mirror shattered into 1,000 razor-sharp pieces. The green light exploded outward in a blinding flash, and the black mist that had been coiling on the floor erupted into a monstrous, shadowy shape. It had no definite form, just a swirling vortex of darkness with screaming faces appearing and disappearing within it. The hooded figures cried out in alarm as the ritual collapsed. The shadow thing shrieked, a sound of pure agony and rage, before it was violently sucked back into the broken shards of the mirror, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Silence descended upon the atrium once more. The hooded figures, their ritual ruined, scrambled away into the darkness and were gone. Elias slowly made his way down the stairs, his legs shaking uncontrollably. He stood over the shattered remains of the mirror, the air still tasting of ozone and fear. He had saved the museum. He had faced the darkness and won. But as he stood there in the silent aftermath, he felt a profound change within himself. He was no longer just the keeper of sleeping stories. He was the guardian of a terrible secret, a warden of a prison made of broken glass. The silence of the museum was no longer peaceful. It was the silence